What's going on, guys, and welcome to Music HQ. Today we're going to be looking at the topic of cultural appropriation and inspiration in music. Let's get right into it.
As the greatest demonstration of freedom
Music HQ.
So this is a big topic, there's no doubt about it. And we're going to have a look at a range of different opinions around the subject. The issue of cultural appropriation is something that's not just limited to music, but of course comes up in many different areas. For example, people who are not of African descent wearing dreadlocks, or people wearing clothing from a culture to which they do not belong. I'm sure we can all think of examples where celebrities have been criticised for cultural appropriation. Of course, we're going to focus our discussion on music, but it's good to look at the wider topic as well. So considering that we're looking at cultural appropriation, I think it's helpful to define culture. So here's the Cambridge Dictionary definition for culture. The way of life, especially the general customs and beliefs of a particular group of people at a particular time. So basically, culture refers to the way of life of a particular group of people. Now, we all belong to loads of different groups of people. And from my in-depth study of this area, it seems that that group could almost be anything. For example, it could be you and your family, you and your friendship group, the region within which you live, your national culture, or lots of other areas where you might find yourself classed within a particular group. That means each of us fall under a load of different groups, and therefore belong to a load of different cultures. One anthropological article states, everyone is simultaneously a member of several different cultural groups, and thus could be said to have multicultural membership. Another interesting point about culture, which is highlighted to us in Lustig and Koester's 1999 article, is that culture is something which is adopted. They state that culture is something that you learn from the people around you as you're socialized. That means that culture comes as a result of nurture and not nature. I'll put some links to the articles in the description below in case you're interested. So basically, to sum it all up, culture is a way of life that you learn from a particular group of people as you are socialized in that group. Considering that we're all parts of loads of different groups of people, we all take a bit from different cultures. So even though you and your sister might both be from the same country, the same town, the same family, you may have adopted different cultural elements of the cultures you've been exposed to, and also may have been exposed to different cultures. So now we understand a bit about culture. What about cultural appropriation? Is it a thing? Can you steal from another culture? Well, many people would argue yes. So let's look at the Cambridge Dictionary definition of cultural appropriation. This is what it says. The act of taking or using things from a culture that is not your own, especially without showing that you understand or respect this culture. Others have defined cultural appropriation in a similar way. The ID YouTube channel did an interesting video on cultural appropriation and fashion. You'll find the link to it in the description below. In the video, one girl argues that cultural appropriation is taking something that has cultural/spiritual significance and stealing from it. An example of this might be going to a fancy dress party wearing a headscarf. This might be seen as disrespectful to the culture from which that headscarf comes if it has cultural, spiritual, or religious significance. Many people would argue that you can't just take what you like from a particular culture and incorporate it into your own lifestyle, particularly if you don't acknowledge the cultural origin. So this brings us on to music. What might cultural appropriation look like in music? Some people argue that Elvis appropriated rock and roll music from African American artists who came before him. Elvis was around in a time when African Americans, or black people in America, mostly listened to music by black artists, whilst white Americans mostly listened to music by white artists. Nevertheless, Elvis really took off because of his unique sound, which was clearly directly influenced by African American musicians at the time. In fact, Elvis even had some of his songs written by Otis Blackwell, a black American musician. So some people might argue that Elvis provided a way for white Americans to listen to black sounding music at a distance from black Americans. Let's move away from the topic of Elvis for a second. Another musician who's been criticised for taking from other cultures is Drake. Drake's song War sounds a lot more like a UK drill song than anything from Drake's Canadian heritage. The beat and the rhyming pattern are extremely reminiscent of the popular UK genre of rap. A third musical example would be that of Antonin Dvorak, the popular Czech composer of the 19th century, who was greatly influenced by African American spirituals. You could arguably claim that he was stealing from the African American culture by incorporating some of those musical ideas into his music. However, even amongst people who strongly believe that cultural appropriation is possible, there is always the question of cultural appropriation or simply inspiration. I've found that there are usually two identifying factors that people use to decide if something is cultural appropriation or just inspiration. The first is acknowledgement. If you acknowledge the culture you're being inspired by, you're much less likely to be criticized for cultural appropriation. In other words, the difference between cultural appropriation and inspiration is one of etiquette and respect. This fits in well with the Cambridge Dictionary definition. These acknowledgements or references to the culture or person that you're being inspired by is a sign of respect and shows that you value the culture from which you're taking your ideas from. There is, of course, no scientific way to actually measure whether something is inspired by something else, so it's down to the individual to identify their inspirations and acknowledge them. Many people would also argue that intention is a major factor in deciding whether something is appropriation or simply inspiration. Was it Elvis, Drake, or Dvorak's intention to promote music from other cultures? Or were they seeking to, in quotes, steal a good idea from these cultures? Again, it's difficult to measure intention, so it's down to the individual to consider this themselves. Let's come back to Elvis. Where do we think he was in terms of intention and acknowledgement? Well, of course, something doesn't feel right about Elvis profiting so much from a style of music that African Americans at the time couldn't profit as much from. However, I could find a couple of examples of Elvis acknowledging his inspirations. One quote is from Jet magazine and reads, "A lot of people seem to think I started this business, but rock and roll was here a long time before I came along. Nobody can sing that kind of music like colored people." Elvis is acknowledging his African American influences. Another quote is from B.B. King, the famous blues musician. He said of Elvis, "I don't think he ripped him off," speaking about the African American musicians before him. "I think once something has been exposed, anyone can add or take from it if they like. He was just so great, so popular and so hot, and so anything that he played became a hit. To me, they didn't make a mistake when they called him the king." So this is a quote coming from a black American at the time and showing that he didn't feel that Elvis had appropriated the music from black American musicians. In fact, B.B. King suggests that Elvis had actually made the music his own. This leads us into the counter-argument, the argument against the concept of cultural appropriation. One issue with the idea of cultural appropriation is something to do with how culture is actually acquired. As we discussed earlier, culture is something that is learned by all people. It's to do with nurture and not nature. Therefore, we all adopt a culture at some point in our lives. So if we've all adopted culture, can any of us really claim ownership over a particular culture? And therefore argue that someone else is stealing from that culture? And to look at a more specific musical example, none of us were born listening or playing a particular kind of music. We all adopt a certain musical culture and musical taste through our parents, our friends around us, and our environment. So again, if we've all adopted a taste or a passion for playing a certain musical style, can we actually claim ownership over it when someone else seeks to adopt it as well, or seeks to take elements from it and incorporate it into their own musical output? A related issue that is sometimes raised with cultural appropriation is who gets to decide whether something is ultimately appropriation or not. Is it anyone who feels that something might be cultural appropriation, or is it just the people who belong to that culture? What happens if two people in that culture disagree? Considering the issues that can be raised with the concept of cultural appropriation, it could be possible to argue that cultural appropriation is another, but perhaps more offensive or negative form of inspiration. In other words, it's not appropriation of, but inspired by another culture. So here's our final Cambridge Dictionary definition of the day. Inspiration, someone or something that gives you ideas for doing something. So there's a super broad definition for you, and you know what, we expect it by now from Cambridge, we expect it. But seriously, the fact that the definition is so broad suggests you can fit a lot of things under the umbrella of inspiration. And actually, inspiration is essential to the development of creative areas. Every artist, musician, or anyone who does anything really has been inspired by someone else. In the case of music, you might listen to a certain song or piece of music and decide to take elements of it that you like and incorporate it into your own music. This would create something new and original from something that was already there. And that's the way that we usually develop. We build upon other people's ideas. So let me just shout out a few musical examples. Afro swing, jazz fusion, Debussy and the influence of gamelan on his music. There are lots of different examples of where people have taken something that's already there, been inspired by it, and used it to create something new, sometimes whole new genres. However, there are some contentious examples like that of Elvis, and I think it would be hard to deny for a lot of people that there are some examples where people might claim something as inspiration, however it just feels a little uncomfortable. Perhaps in these cases, you might think it's more apt to use the term cultural appropriation. I really haven't reached any firm conclusions on this topic, and I think the more I look into it, the more I see how complex it is. I think valid points can be raised both for and against the idea of cultural appropriation. Each person belongs to many different groups and therefore many different cultures to varying extents. And we adopt or become part of this culture through nurture, not by nature. Therefore, can anyone really claim ownership over a culture? Nevertheless, there has to be respect for cultures you haven't adopted or do not belong to. So I will say this. If we're taking inspiration from another culture, I think that it's really important that we acknowledge where we're taking inspiration from. That's respectful in any context. And of course, as per usual, it's good to look into your intention for doing something. What's your reasoning behind it? So thank you so much guys for watching this video. It's been extremely tricky for me to make this, particularly because it's a hard and sensitive topic, but I hope that I was able to do it justice. I've tried to look at both sides of the argument, for and against the idea of cultural appropriation, and I hope that it's helped you consider these ideas a bit more. Check out the playlist in the description below. It's basically a playlist with a mix of music that has been created as a result of a combination of different cultures. Also, let me know some of the music that you listen to that you think is cool that has been inspired by other cultures. So that's all for today guys. Don't forget to check out the other videos on the channel, and I hope to see you next time on Music HQ. Thanks for watching.